The life according to reason is best and pleasantest, since reason more than anything else is man. This life, therefore, is also the happiest. Aristotle. So we continue then with why he thinks this is the happiest life, why the life that is lived in accordance to reason, that exercises reason, is the happiest life. Rational activity is where we left off, what that broke down into for Aristotle, and I want to talk now about his understanding of virtue. So the translation of the Greek word is arete, and the translation is often virtue. And sometimes, however, you will see the word excellence with it, or instead of virtue. So if you hear virtues or you hear excellences, we're meaning the same thing here. And in particular, when it comes to your ethical character, we're talking about the moral virtues, the moral excellences, to be distinguished from intellectual virtues or intellectual excellences. Those, for Aristotle, have mainly to do with your rational part, right, to the exclusion of your non-rational part. When we're talking about your kind of intellectual pursuits and your theoretical pursuits and your contemplative exercises of the mind, where you gauge in perhaps metaphysical activities of study and whatnot, those would build certain kind of intellectual virtues. But when we're talking about your actions and your habits and your conduct, and the way in which you engage and interact with other human beings and with the world, we're talking about your moral virtues and excellences. So a couple of things about what these things are. For Aristotle, a virtue or an excellence is a disposition, a good disposition, the kind of ideal disposition you want to be in for your character. It's kind of an inclination to act in a certain way. You know, you are able to be at a place in your life where a situation or something presents itself to you and you can respond in a way that is good, that is the best way to respond, that actually requires a thoughtful, rational approach, but you want to prepare yourself for being able to respond in that way. You want to cultivate that disposition. So for Aristotle, we can cultivate these dispositions. We are different than natural objects out there in the world, like stones, for instance. So the behavior of a stone, Aristotle will say, is kind of innate to the stone. If you drop a stone from a cliff, it will fall. It will go in one direction. And so it's kind of built into the behavior of the stone to go in that direction. Same thing he says with fire, right? Fire will always burn up. You know, it's not going to burn to the side or burn down. The flame will always rise. And this is innate to that kind of natural phenomenon. Moral dispositions, ideal states of character, are not innate to you. You can develop these. You can educate and train yourself in such a way to arrive at a position in your life where you do have this disposition, this inclination, this state of acting toward the best outcome, for instance. So these virtues, these excellences, are not innate. They're not born this way. This is very important to understand, because no one is born good for Aristotle. No one is born bad. No one is born virtuous. No one is born vicious. That would be the opposite of virtuous, right? The vices that someone might have, for Aristotle, are vices that someone, uh, you know, ends up acquiring over their life. They're not born into the world bad or evil. Um, so, what's important then is to recognize that you have the potential to be virtuous. You have the ability or capacity, and this has to be fostered within you. This is why I had this opening video with the photo of the children there, working together, learning together, figuring things out together, playing together, ultimately developing together a kind of knowledge, right? Developing certain kinds of discipline and habits of mind that they can go ahead and cultivate a stronger, for Aristotle, character overall. It's important for Aristotle in your youth to be exposed to these kinds of conditions that will enable and foster you to build your character, to develop certain virtues within you. The older you get, the harder it is. It's like learning a language in this way. The more exposure you have to to virtuous activity around you in your youth, the more likely, it's not a sure bet, but the more likely you yourself can form and develop in a way that is virtuous. You're not born with it, but it can be cultivated and developed within you. And then you can do the hard work yourself to become virtuous, as you get older. But again, it is tougher as we get older to break habits. And if we develop, for Aristotle, bad habits, vicious habits, vices, that it makes it more of an obstacle for us to overturn those in our life. So practice and training and habit is vital for Aristotle when it comes to building a character, a moral character, that you have to put yourself in positions that demand of you to be virtuous, to act rightly. You can't, for Aristotle, become a virtuous person and sit on the sidelines your entire life. You have to, maybe put yourself out there. A friend is in need. You can't kind of run from that and tell yourself excuses of why you can't help out. You need to put yourself in a position where you can help, and you would build a character by putting yourself in those positions. You're not always going to be successful. You might not be able to help, but you have to expose yourself to interactions with people. The person, for Aristotle, who goes off, lives alone, in the woods, they might experience a certain kind of calm, and they might not be disturbed much in their life, but they're not going to actualize everything they can be as a human being. They are not going to realize their best versions of themselves, because they're not going to find challenges in their life where they are tested and where they can express these kinds of virtues, like patience, like friendliness, like generosity, like temperance. And we'll get into more of these virtues as well in a little bit here. So you need to, for Aristotle, over and over and over again, put yourself in positions that demand virtuous activity from you. Just like a builder, he says, is not going to become a good builder if he or she never actually gets out there and builds anything. You can study it all you want in textbooks, you can do the theory, but you actually have to get out there and put yourself into the profession and make your mistakes and learn from them. Take, for instance, sports. A good analogy here, I believe, and I've had kind of images of athletes all through Aristotle's section here. So we take Derek Jeter from the New York Yankees, or he's retired in the last few years, but one of their great hitters in recent memory. And he talks about how he loves batting practice. No one really gets to see him in batting practice unless you go early to the games. But you really just see the highlights. or you really just saw the highlights when he was playing of him hitting, and he knew, he wasn't a power hitter. He wasn't, gonna drill a home run, well over the fence, over 450 feet or anything like that. He was gonna be a consistent, reliable hitter that could figure out where to put the ball in play, that kind of thing, move the runners on base, that kind of thing. A smart hitter, a reliable hitter, a consistent hitter. And so what you saw in the game was a result of that day in and day out practice in the batting cage, right? So you have to practice virtuous activity in order to become a virtuous person. So for Aristotle, the more we practice virtuous acts, the more we become virtuous. And the more we become virtuous, the more we'll naturally perform virtuous acts. So to analogize with respect to Jeter here in hitting, the more he practices batting, well, the better at bat he will be during the game, right? And the better he is at bat, just the more natural that will be to him every time he steps up to the plate. And he will end up being consistent. He will end up being resolute and firm in the way he approaches hitting, batting in a game. Just like you will be more consistent, more firm in your character the more you practice virtuous activity and become and develop a virtuous character. Now, I talked earlier about how Aristotle does tie pleasure to being happy and to being virtuous. And one of the ways in which you can kind of gauge where you are ethically in terms of your own character development is to take stock of how much pleasure you get from performing virtuous actions, and how much it might pain you to do these things, right? So a quick story here, when I lived in Stanton, just about 20 miles south on 81 of Harrisonburg, I now live in Harrisonburg, but this was a couple of years ago. I was living in Stanton for some time, and my neighbor had a driveway that was a 45-degree angle. And my neighbor was up there in years. He was mid-70s, and he actually had to have surgery on his leg, where he had to have part of his leg removed. So they had a prosthetic. And when it would snow, I would go out and shovel my driveway and kind of look over to my neighbor's driveway and see it covered in snow. And I will admit, at first, I was like, well, man, I don't want to shovel that, even though I know it's the right thing to do. It's the generous thing to do. It's the thing I should do. I don't want to do it. But, I kind of did it, and at first it was like, this is a pain in the neck, and you felt that way. And then you did it, and it was done, and he was grateful, and you were kind of like, you know what, that was kind of nice to do, to just give yourself a little bit there up, your time and your energy, and do something like that for someone else. And so next time when it snowed, you kind of then recall that, and you do it again. And maybe this time you do it, it's not as painful. You're not doing it in a way that it's like, I gotta do this. It's like, yeah, I'm gonna do this. This is what I want to do. And the more you do that kind of activity, the more pleasurable you will find it. Aristotle says, if acting virtually feels natural and pleasurable, then you are closer to being a virtuous person. That is, to being morally excellent, right? You become more natural at it. And so you prepare yourself in a way to respond to future circumstances, future situations where your help or generosity might be needed. And you don't, you take joy in it. You take pleasure in it. You don't stop. You don't hesitate. You don't sit there and feel pained about it. The more you practice it is what he's saying. So if you're not, though, if you are feeling a lot of pain and, like this is a hassle to have to do, um, then, you need to work on yourself and you need to practice virtue more. Another example I like to give is, I love my family back home in New York. I've been in contact with them, of course, during all of this. They're, pretty close to the epicenter in Queens there. Um, but I will say, when I visit them, I have to practice being virtuous. I have to practice being patient, because if anybody can get to me, it is my family. Whether the conversation turns this way or that, I need to be extra kind of mindful of my own emotions and how I handle my relations with them. There's a reason why I live almost, 7 hours away from them. And you can say, well, maybe I need to work on things a little myself, right? Maybe I need to work on my own character development when it comes to those interactions. Maybe I need to put myself in situations more often, to cultivate and foster that development. So sure. The other thing I want to point out too is the moment that you find yourselves in now in your life here with this great challenge of social distancing and this challenge of where you are with respect to your studies and your home life and your work and your family and all of that. What is it that you can work on? What is it that you can practice? How can you become more virtuous? Again, not that you're going to be perfect and not that you're going to succeed all the time, but what is it that you can use here in a way to strengthen your own moral character is what for Aristotle this moment would demand of us, this articulation of our own values to ourselves, and then the exercise that it takes from us to actually live those values, right? And become better people as a result. So something to think about and how to, maybe draw on Aristotle for things we're talking about here. So we have moral virtues. Excellence is our good dispositions. They are not innate. They are developed. We have the potential to become virtuous through our practice of virtues and training and education and habit. We have to become aware of our emotions and feelings and desires in order for our rational part, our reason, to guide those emotions. And what we're trying to guide those emotions toward, Aristotle would say, is a midpoint between two extremes of that emotion, two extremes of that feeling or action. That our reason is used to discern how we ought to calibrate our feelings, our emotions, our attitudes, and what action we need to take in a given circumstance. So he argues this because he says, look, what actually corrupts people? What is it that, makes people bad or act badly? He says it's usually because they've gone way too far and have pursued an excess. Think of the person who's way too greedy, for instance, and just pursues money at all costs. Or it's a deficiency, he said. It's a lack of something. So the extremes are either an excess, and that corrupts somebody, or it's a complete, it's the opposite of that. It's a not allowing yourself at all of anything. Maybe the person who doesn't care at all about providing for themselves to live, to sustain themselves or sustain the people that they're responsible for. that they don't take that into account. So it's a deficiency. The person that just wastes maybe money, that too is a defect, he says. So what you want to do is find the midpoint in anything you do, because it's the extremes, the excess, and the deficiency that causes corruption, that causes you to act badly. You can think of this again in terms of sports, in terms of athletics. Let's say it's weight training, or becoming physically fit. If you go to the gym, every day for hours upon hours, I mean every day, 7 days a week, hours upon hours, and you're lifting, let's say, way more than you can lift, that your body would indicate for you to lift, then you're at one extreme, and you're probably going to hurt yourself, and you're not giving yourself enough time to recover and build muscle in the right way. Of course, if you're still trying to get fit and you go to the other extreme where you don't really lift at all, maybe you lift once a week at most, and it's just very briefly, and it's very little weight, and you're mostly just socializing at the gym or so. Well, that for him is on the other side of things, and you're not going to get the strength that you are aiming for and the fitness that you're aiming for if you're not lifting where you ought to be in terms of the midpoint. Not too much, not too little, but just the right amount, and just the right amount of times a week. He says, a master of any art avoids excess and defect, seeks the intermediate, and chooses this. So you see, remember that painting of Raphael there, the School of Athens, with Plato pointing up to the heavens and Aristotle kind of midway, right? And that book he's holding there says ethics. We want to be midway between two extremes, between excess and defect or deficiency. So here is a table of virtues and vices that Aristotle, in the lectures, he talks about these spheres of feeling and actions. So you can take some of these actions, some of these feelings, and look at, well, what would be a deficiency in that feeling, and what would be an excess in that feeling, and what would be the mean point, or the midway point, the virtue. If we look, for instance, at the first one here, well, let's look at this quote first. To feel things at the right times with reference to the right objects, toward the right people, with the right motive, and in the right way is what is both intermediate and best. And this is characteristic of virtue. And this requires your reason. This requires your rational part guiding your feelings, guiding the way in which those feelings come out in your actions. So those spheres of actions and feelings, if we look, for instance, at confidence, every person has to do this for themselves. Remember, Aristotle says human beings are messy, interactions are messy, and we can only give an outline of how to sketch an ethics for people to apply to themselves. So each person has to kind of take stock and say, all right, well, when I'm presented with a situation, do I tend to be overconfident, underconfident, or I have the right amount of confidence? And so if you have a deficiency in confidence, maybe you tend to actually act cowardly. You back away, shy away from certain situations because of a fear that you have that might not be rational. So you tend to be more cowardly in your interactions. But maybe you're on the other end of that. You have to, again, kind of register this for yourself and see where you are in your life. Maybe you find yourself in most situations acting overconfidently. You just kind of throw yourself into things. You're a bit foolhardy and rash in what you decide to do, and you jump in, and maybe you put yourself in a situation that can harm yourself or harm others even. So maybe you're on the excess side. Either way, deficiency or excess. It's a vice to have overconfidence or to have too little confidence. And so what you're striving for is that mean point for Aristotle. You're striving to get somewhere there. So you have to recognize, you have to be self-aware, kind of be in tune with how your feelings and your actions are playing out, and then try to correct your behavior. Try to practice certain habits, certain activities that will create habits that will get you closer to being courageous. So if you tend to act, rash, well, maybe you need to actually be a little more cowardly here and there. Maybe you need to kind of, head toward that end of the spectrum to arrive at the mean. Or if you're acting cowardly more often than not, maybe you need to just jump into something here and there to kind of push you and your character toward the mean point of being more courageous. Self-expressiveness, and here he's talking about how you express like you and your maybe accomplishments and what you've done. So there are people on the one hand who are, very modest, and it's a false modesty. They're almost not going to say they've accomplished anything, and so there's almost modest to a fault, right? Will not recognize the worth of their own accomplishments. And then there's the person who is extremely boastful, right, and just thinks that they're perfect and have done everything right, and they can do no wrong, and they take credit for even things probably that they are not even responsible for. There's that person out there for sure. So you have those two extremes, but they're both vices, and what you want to try is to find that truthful account of really what you can say you've accomplished, what you can say other people have accomplished, and how maybe they've helped you, for instance, without being too modest about it and without being too boastful about it. Another example would be, for instance, how you spend or how you give, right? You could be on the one side where you don't give at all, you just stow away and hold everything yourself, you hoard maybe, and then you could be wasteful, prodigal, right? You can just be spending and giving way too much that you're not quite actually taking care of yourself in ways that you ought to be. So the idea is to be generous, right? But not to be wasteful in this case. Another example would be how you understand the role of pleasure in your life, and whether or not, for instance, you overindulge as an excess. You just go after every pleasure that is there for you, and you seek out, and you take it way too far, maybe on the weekends especially, or you used to at least. Or you don't take in any pleasure. You're kind of just cut yourself off from all of that and experiencing that, and just don't enjoy the things that are available to you to enjoy. So you want to find a temperate level, a temperance, where you can enjoy things but not to an excess. So I encourage you to go through this and ask yourself where you are on some of these, what side you are on. If maybe you're an excess on one thing and you're a deficiency on the other, and so forth and so on. And Aristotle is saying it's not, again, a perfect science here, but you're going to have to practice actions that will get you closer to the mean, and that requires you exercise your reason as you attempt to develop your character in the strongest way, as you attempt to actualize the best version of yourself. So in summary here, Aristotle's notion of happiness is this notion of eudaimonia, the flourishing life, the flourishing being. It is not an emotion, it is not a state of mind or a mood. It is a way of living that through practice and habit you can work at. You can develop a disposition, a way of being. It consists in an engaged life, one that puts itself in positions where it's challenged, wherein we exercise our reason to understand and cultivate healthy emotions, the midpoint, right, the mean, and to inform and strengthen the resolve of our actions and conduct in every area of our lives. That is, to feel and act as best we can in accordance with the virtues. And the joy and pleasure that comes along with this way of living is the joy and pleasure of actualizing what is your human potential.